Imagine if Kim Kardashian suddenly vanished from the spotlight. No money, no followers, no influence. That's exactly what happened to Anita Ekberg. She was the original Hollywood it girl, and when Hollywood was done with her, they erased her like she never existed. Swedish beauty in the spotlight. Kirsten Anita Marianne Ekberg wasn't dreaming of Hollywood. Born in 1931 in Malmö, Sweden, she was the sixth of 8 children in a working-class family. Acting wasn't on the radar. Pageants? Not really. But standing nearly 5 feet 7 inches with striking blue eyes and an hourglass figure, she stood out. At 18, she entered Miss Sweden and won. The title came with an unexpected ticket to the Miss Universe pageant in America. She didn't take home the crown, but that didn't matter. Her real prize was catching the attention of Universal Pictures. The studio saw potential, or more accurately, they saw a blonde bombshell they could mold into the next Hollywood sensation. A contract landed in front of her. No experience? No problem. Hollywood had a system for that. Once she arrived in Los Angeles, the real work began. English lessons, voice coaching, acting classes, every major studio had a formula to create a star. But learning lines wasn't the priority. Publicity was. Universal plastered her in magazines, setting up glamorous photo shoots that emphasized her figure. The iceberg, as some called her, was their answer to Marilyn Monroe, except colder, more unattainable. She was sent to premieres, mingling with A-listers to build an image before she even had a real role. These stunts worked. The press couldn't get enough of her. But inside the studio, there was a problem. Universal didn't know what to do with her. The first film appearances were blink and you'll miss it moments. Background roles, arm candy, nameless eye candy. The studio gave her a handful of minor parts, but never a real chance. It didn't take long for them to decide she lacks acting potential. 6 months in, Universal dropped her. For most Hollywood newcomers, that would have been the end. A plane ticket back to Sweden. A forgotten name in a pile of failed starlets. But Anita Ekberg wasn't done. Instead of retreating, she leaned into modeling, covers of magazines, pin-up photos that flew off newsstands. Peter Gowland, a top photographer, made her a staple of the 1950s pin-up scene. That gamble paid off. These images caught the eye of John Wayne. He cast her in Blood Alley, 1955. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Suddenly, Hollywood took another look. Paramount Pictures came calling. This time, it wasn't just for press shots. Anita Ekberg was back in the game. Finding a place in Hollywood. Hollywood had rules. If you were a blonde bombshell in the 1950s, you had 2 paths. You could be the next Marilyn Monroe, or you could be forgotten. Anita Ekberg wasn't about to let the second one happen. After a brief role in Blood Alley, 1955, Paramount Pictures took a chance on her. They didn't see an actress. They saw an asset. Their mission? Sell her as Hollywood's next big thing. The studio had a formula for stardom. It wasn't about talent. It was about image. Ekberg was sent to glitzy Hollywood parties, strategically placed next to the biggest names in the business. Photo shoots were arranged, plastering her across fan magazines. Studio publicists fed stories to gossip columns, painting her as a dazzling newcomer. Everything was designed to make her a household name before she even had a real career. Ekberg was placed in big-budget films alongside major stars, not as the lead, but as the distraction. In War and Peace, 1956, she played a glamorous aristocrat opposite Audrey Hepburn and Henry Fonda. The film was a massive production, but Ekberg's role, pure decoration. Then came Hollywood or Bust, 1956, a comedy with Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. The title was ironic, because for her, this was a make-or-break moment. She had the looks, the presence, but could she act? Studios weren't convinced. Critics weren't either. The press described her as decorative. The message was clear. She was there to be looked at, not taken seriously. Despite that, she wasn't going unnoticed. Famed columnist Walter Winchell called her the most perfectly constructed blonde ever. Directors kept casting her, but always in roles that didn't require depth. By the late 1950s, her on-screen image as a sex symbol started overshadowing her career. She was featured in countless pin-up spreads, labeled as one of Hollywood's most desirable women. Fans loved it. Casting agents? Not so much. Meanwhile, European actresses like Sophia Loren were proving their versatility. They played dramatic roles, showed range, and built lasting careers. Loren had been cast in challenging roles that showed depth, proving she was more than just a beauty. Ekberg, on the other hand, was still Hollywood's go-to exotic blonde. She tried breaking the mold, took roles in Paris Holiday, 1958, with Bob Hope, hoping comedy would give her a fresh start. But the industry had already made up its mind. She was a face, not a talent. By the late 1950s, her Hollywood career was stalling. Paramount had promoted her, used her, but never truly invested in her. She wasn't being offered the roles that made a career last. The industry was shifting. Studios were looking for more than just a pretty face. The new wave of actresses, Elizabeth Taylor, Shirley MacLaine, and even young newcomers like Jane Fonda, were proving they could be more than just beautiful. Ekberg, despite her fame, was being left behind. She was famous. But fame wasn't translating into respect. She needed something big, something to make Hollywood take her seriously. Then, in 1960, Federico Fellini called, everything was about to change. A career in limbo. By 1960, Hollywood had given up on Anita Ekberg. She was famous but not respected, glamorous but not essential. Then Federico Fellini saw something others didn't. The Italian director was preparing a film that would redefine cinema. La Dolce Vita wasn't a traditional Hollywood production. It was stylish, provocative, and unlike anything Ekberg had done before. Fellini didn't just want a blonde bombshell, he wanted an icon. The role of Sylvia wasn't complex. She was a famous actress, desired by everyone, but truly known by no one. Ekberg didn't need to act much. She just had to be Sylvia. Then came the Trevi Fountain scene. Filming took place on a freezing winter night in Rome. Ekberg, draped in a flowing black gown, stepped into the cold waters of the Trevi Fountain, calling to Marcello Mastroianni. She was hypnotic, ethereal, a living fantasy. Mastroianni, struggling through the cold, reportedly had to wear a wetsuit under his tuxedo just to endure the temperature. Ekberg? She didn't flinch. She moved through the water as if she were made for it. The scene was electric. Even Pope John XXIII reportedly criticized it for being immoral. That only made it more famous. When La Dolce Vita premiered, it was an instant phenomenon. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. It shocked audiences, outraged censors, and redefined European cinema. Ekberg became the face of it all. The press couldn't stop talking about her. The Trevi Fountain scene turned her into a global symbol of beauty and mystery. But there was a catch. The role that made her immortal also typecast her forever. Directors didn't see a rising actress. They saw a fantasy. Producers weren't offering complex scripts. They wanted Sylvia. Fellini remained a fan. He cast her in Boccaccio 70, 1962, and later The Clowns, 1970. But outside of Italy, the phone stopped ringing. Hollywood turns its back on her. After La Dolce Vita, Anita Ekberg had everything: fame, international recognition, and a defining cinematic moment. But none of it translated into what she wanted most: a serious Hollywood career. The industry had already made up its mind. She wasn't a leading lady. She was an image. She returned to the U.S., hoping her European success would change things. It didn't. Studios still saw her as a one-note star. No challenging roles, no career reinvention, just more offers to play the blonde bombshell. Sophia Loren was getting dramatic roles. Brigitte Bardot was proving herself as more than a pin-up. Even Marilyn Monroe, despite her struggles, had a legacy Hollywood was invested in. Ekberg? She was trapped. She landed a role in Four for Texas, 1963, starring alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. On paper, it looked like a comeback. In reality, she was just window dressing. It was the same story with Woman Times 7, 1967, an anthology film featuring Shirley MacLaine. A decent cast, a well-known director, but Ekberg's presence barely mattered. Meanwhile, Hollywood was changing. The 60s ushered in a new era. Sex symbols weren't enough anymore. Actresses had to be versatile. Studios wanted stars who could carry a film, not just decorate it. Younger faces were taking over. Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, Raquel Welch, actresses who blended beauty with depth. Ekberg was left behind. Hollywood had shut the door, and she never found a way to reopen it. A tumultuous love life. Anita Ekberg's name was in the press as much for her personal life as for her movies. The tabloids loved her. And Hollywood? Not in a good way. Her beauty made her irresistible to the world's most powerful men. Actors, singers, billionaires. She was linked to them all. The rumors started with Frank Sinatra. He had a thing for glamorous blondes, and she fit the bill. Were they serious? Probably not. But the press made sure everyone thought so. Then came Tyrone Power, one of Hollywood's biggest leading men. They were seen together just before he died suddenly in 1958. Whether they were truly involved is up for debate, but Ekberg's name was in every headline. Then there was Gianni Agnelli, the heir to the Fiat empire. He had a reputation for seducing Hollywood's most stunning women, and Ekberg was one of them. Italian newspapers loved their supposed affair, adding fuel to her growing status as Europe's most talked-about actress. But her most chaotic relationship was with Anthony Steele. A British actor, Steele was once poised for stardom. Then he met Ekberg. Instead of being Hollywood's next power couple, they became tabloid gold, for all the wrong reasons. Steele had a drinking problem, and a jealousy problem, and a temper. The fights were legendary. One night, he allegedly destroyed their home in a drunken rage. Another time, he accused her of cheating in public, making a scene at a glamorous party. Despite the drama, they married in 1956. It lasted 3 years. By the time the divorce was finalized in 1959, Steele's career was over. Ekberg's was still alive, but barely. Even after her marriage ended, she stayed a favorite target for the press. By the 1960s, her film career was slowing down, but the tabloids weren't done with her. Rumors swirled that she had an affair with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi of Iran. Some claimed she had been secretly invited to his palace. She denied everything. Whether true or not, her reputation was now built on scandal, not talent. And in Hollywood, that was a problem. Directors wanted actresses who took their careers seriously, not ones making headlines for their personal lives. Desperate attempts to stay relevant. Hollywood had shut Anita out. Europe still gave her work, but the roles weren't meaningful. She was famous, but fame wasn't getting her anywhere. Directors weren't casting her in serious films. Instead, she was booked for forgettable projects, low-budget comedies, action films, and movies that existed to show off her looks rather than her talent. In 1963, she starred in 4 for Texas alongside Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin. On paper, it seemed like a solid opportunity. Big stars, a mainstream Hollywood production, but her role was just another sexy distraction. She was still playing the same one-dimensional bombshell characters Hollywood had always given her. A few years later, she appeared in Woman x 7, 1967, an ensemble film led by Shirley MacLaine. It was a respectable project with an acclaimed director, Vittorio De Sica, but Ekberg's part was small. A decade earlier, she had been treated as a rising star. Now, she was barely making an impact. Meanwhile, the industry was moving on. Hollywood was no longer obsessed with glamorous European bombshells. The 1970s ushered in a new era of filmmaking, gritty, realistic, and socially conscious. Women like Jane Fonda, Faye Dunaway, and Ellen Burstyn were leading blockbusters, not just looking good in them. Ekberg was stuck in the past. Desperate to keep her career alive, she returned to Italy. It seemed like a smart move. After all, La Dolce Vita had made her an icon there, but even Italy wasn't the same anymore. The golden era of extravagant, glamorous European cinema was fading. Realism and political storytelling were taking over. Directors were casting women with depth and versatility, and Ekberg's name wasn't on the list. She reunited with Federico Fellini for The Clowns, 1970. It should have been a big deal. But the film wasn't a success. and Ekberg's role was minor. She was a shadow of what she once was. More minor European films followed. She worked steadily, but the films were low budget and forgettable. By the 1980s, things were getting worse. The offers slowed to a trickle. When she did get cast, it was in B-movies. She appeared in low-quality Italian productions and forgettable roles that barely played outside of Europe. She had once been the face of European cinema. Now she was just a familiar name clinging to an industry that had moved on. By the 1990s, her film career was barely alive. There were no major directors calling, no starring roles, no career revival. Instead, she made random appearances in small projects, often playing exaggerated versions of herself, a guest spot on an Italian TV show, a cameo in a film few people watched. The glamour was gone. Even Federico Fellini, her biggest supporter, passed away in 1993. With him, the last real connection to her golden years was gone. It was clear her career was over, but instead of stepping away gracefully, she kept taking whatever she could get. A woman who had once worked with Hollywood's biggest names was now appearing in direct-to-video flops. By the time the 2000s arrived, the work had dried up completely. There were no big comebacks, no second chances, no reinvention. Ekberg had been one of the most famous women in the world. Now she was barely a footnote in Hollywood history. Financial ruin and personal hardships. For decades, she had lived like the fortune would never dry up. Lavish homes, extravagant shopping sprees, five-star hotels, she never held back. Unlike other stars who invested wisely or built second careers, she spent without caution. She had never imagined a life where the film offers stopped. But they did. Hollywood had already abandoned her, and Europe was no longer paying her bills. By the 1990s, the financial trouble turned into a full-blown crisis. She had no steady income, no savings, and no fallback plan. Then came the Italian tax authorities. In 1999, she was accused of owing nearly $350,000 in unpaid taxes. She denied it, calling the claims exaggerated, but the legal battle dragged on for years. The penalties kept growing, the stress piled up. Whatever little money she had left was disappearing fast. Then, in 2004, disaster struck again. While she was away, burglars broke into her villa outside of Rome. They took everything: jewelry, furniture, valuables, even personal keepsakes from her Hollywood days. The few remnants of her once glamorous life were gone in an instant. She later claimed the thieves were people she trusted, maybe former employees, maybe old acquaintances. But by then, it didn't matter. The damage was done. With no career, no major assets, and no way to recover financially, she was forced to downsize her life completely. Her beloved villa, where she had lived for decades, was repossessed. She had no choice but to move into a modest home outside of Rome. The woman who had once graced magazine covers, red carpets, and exclusive parties was now struggling just to keep a roof over her head. But she never admitted defeat. Even when the press caught glimpses of her in later years, heavier, older, no longer the bombshell, she still carried herself like a star. She refused to beg for money, refused to sell her story to tabloids. When asked about her financial struggles, she shrugged it off, saying, "I have lived, I have loved, I have had adventures." But behind closed doors, the reality was grim. Health problems were piling up: diabetes, arthritis, chronic pain. The years of indulgence and excess had caught up with her. By the late 2000s, she was barely able to walk. But she didn't want pity. She refused to ask for help, even when she needed it. Then, in 2011, disaster struck again. A bad fall left her with a fractured hip and femur. The injury ended her independence completely. She was now confined to a wheelchair, reliant on others for basic needs. Medical bills piled up, money was running out. In one of her final interviews, she admitted she had no family to rely on, no financial safety net. She was living in a modest care home outside Rome, surviving on a small pension. She had once ruled the silver screen. Now she was alone, forgotten, and barely getting by. The fall had taken her mobility, but Hollywood had taken everything else. How Hollywood forgot Anita Ekberg. Anita Ekberg's name was barely mentioned in Hollywood. Her face was still immortalized in La Dolce Vita, but the woman herself? She was forgotten. No industry tributes, no retrospectives, just a fading memory of a time when she had been everywhere. In 2011, after her crippling fall left her wheelchair-bound, she made one final plea for help. She reached out to the Fellini Foundation hoping for financial assistance. The response? Silence. The same industry that once paraded her around like a goddess had left her to fend for herself. Meanwhile, her contemporaries, Sophia Loren, Brigitte Bardot, even Marilyn Monroe's legacy, were still celebrated. Their films were studied, their careers honored. Ekberg? She had no such revival. On January 11, 2015, at 83 years old, she passed away in a small clinic in Italy. The cause? Complications from long-term illnesses. There was no Hollywood send-off, no major tributes, just a brief news cycle mention before the world moved on. Even in death, she was overshadowed. Her passing came days before the Oscars, an event where Hollywood celebrates itself. Not a single mention of her that night. The industry that once built her up had erased her like she was never there. Meanwhile, La Dolce Vita remained a cinematic masterpiece. The Trevi Fountain scene still graced film school lectures and pop culture discussions, but Ekberg's role in it was often reduced to a visual, not a performance. Critics credited Fellini for the scene's magic. Some argued Marcello Mastroianni's reaction was what made it work. Ekberg was just there. That's how Hollywood remembered her. Not as an actress, but as a beautiful image frozen in time. Unlike her peers, she never reinvented herself. Never became a producer, director, or industry powerhouse. She let Hollywood define her,